It's me, Boulevard, the caster, the tournament analyst, the guy who just really doesn't care about ladder, like, at all. I mean, if you look at High Master, they really just, I mean, they just let anybody in here. But I do like tournaments a lot, and I figure there are others with similar feelings, so I made a patch 1.2 tier list specific to a best of 3 Conquest region locked format, as that's the standard tournament format being used in the West. Before I actually get into it, just in case you get bored and turn it off like halfway through, I don't want you to miss this. So I made a spreadsheet with the tier list on it and provided example links to the decks so that you can net deck tournament builds specifically, since decks tend to not look 100% the same between ladder and events. So please feel free to use this and share that around with your friends and stuff. I'm going to continuously update it after tournament weekends because tier list should be fluid and changing with new information and new patches and things like that. So this will be the baseline sheet that I'll be updating consistently. The link should be the same, but I just feel like it can be difficult to go on one of the deck websites, be it Dex or Runeterra or Mobilytics, and find, for example, like a tournament topping sea monster list versus a ladder list. So I really just wanted to create a resource for people who were specifically looking for tournament decks. So this is my patch 1.2 tournament tier list. If a deck is missing from this lineup, it's because it was kind of a one-off deck that I don't expect that we'll see again. It was something that maybe topped early on, kind of like standalone, and I don't think it's going to pop up consistently. If you see something missing from this list, such as the new elusive burn deck that's come out, it's because it hasn't popped up in tournaments yet, so I don't know what kind of lineups are going to be built around it and where it should actually fit into this. But as I had mentioned previously, in the description down below, I am going to have a Google Doc with this tier list on it and sample deck lists for all of these, and that one will be constantly updated. So check back on that one every weekend to see what's kind of changed, as I won't be doing a video for this consistently. So I rated every deck on 3 criteria: the power level of the deck itself, the consistency of the deck itself, and the power of the lineup that you can bring it in. In other words, like, how much does this regional composition hurt the rest of your lineup? In tier 0, we have nothing, because tier 0 is reserved for cuckoo bonkers decks that are absolutely insane. People throw this like word around way too often. It's a common phrase in card games. I think people overuse the hell out of it. If you ever see me use it, understand that Viheimer didn't make it to tier 0 for me, especially in tournaments. So tier 1, we have Viheimer, Karma Ezreal. These decks are pretty close in power level and consistency. Viheimer's a little bit higher in power, Karma Ezreal's a little bit higher in consistency, since you don't have to see the Heimer on curve. Heimer, of course, can take over games in OTK much faster. It's harder to play around because it's proactive. Overall, if you split up Ionia and PNZ, you don't actually get a whole lot of options, which is kind of weird because these are 2 of the most powerful regions, but they're powerful regions when paired together especially, and I'll get into that a little bit later. Frostbite and Swain Sejuani, very powerful, very consistent. These actually fit in great with a lot of lineups because Freljord and Noxus were 2 of the most underrepresented regions during patch 1.0. Being able to pair these 2 sort of underused regions together and have them fit together so well and come out in different forms just really speaks to the power level and overall flexibility of the regional composition. Frostbite Control and Swain Sejuani are actually very different, much more different than Viheimer and Karma Ezreal. Frostbite is a much more mid-game focused deck with like one-sided board wipes. Swain Sejuani is very early and late game focused, but very notably has the off-turn activators for Sejuani, which is something that I value a lot in the current format. In terms of high power and high consistency, Sea Monster is definitely one of the better Shadow Isle decks at the moment, as well as one of the better Bilgewater decks, and it just kind of rounds out the rest of these lineups so well that I think its impact can't be understated. It doesn't really take a lot away if you don't want to run one of these. Of course, Demacia slots into a lineup like this very well. You know, you take Scouts off the table, but none of the Bilgewater decks really compare in power to Sea Monsters, and that's kind of one of the reasons we consistently see it come out. So tier 2 is where we generally find the decks starting to lack in one area, or maybe they just don't match up well against the tier 1 decks, and since tier 1 decks are popular, you need to match up well to them if you're going to win a tournament. Scouts and Bannermen are probably the best aggressive decks in the format currently, as well as just the best Demacia decks. Lucian Bannerman is actually very flexible on the regional composition you can fit it in, and Scouts rounds out a lot of lineups very well as sort of that third deck once you've kind of picked your 2 power decks. Generally, you're left with something like Bilgewater, Noxus, and Demacia, and you just kind of pick up Scouts as that third deck. They get to attack some of the weaknesses of some of the tier 1 decks, which is pretty nice. They all kind of have weaker early games. Overall, the power level of them is kind of mid. The consistency is also a little mid-level. How they fit into lineups is really where they shine. These decks are a little bit combo-based. Lucian really wants to hit Lucian Senna to be able to take over games, needs to maintain the board for relentless pursuits. Scouts is one of the decks that actually gets affected, I think, the most by going second or first. If you go second, then you can upgrade your MF on 6 because you can play an Island Navigator, get the Scout attack on 4, get the Scout attack on 6, Whereas if you go first, things get a little bit more awkward, and giving your opponent that extra turn not to level up your MF just makes a big difference in a couple of matchups. Indoor Spiders, very high in power, kind of medium in consistency, and then pretty medium in how it fits into lineups currently. Previously, the power of Indoor Spiders was how well it fit into lineups, because Freljord was really underused, so pairing your Shadow Isle with it was great. But with Frostbite and Swain Sejuani kind of coming out as very powerful Freljord options, it feels like it takes a little bit too much out of the lineup, as we see some of the other Shadow Isle decks are really where powerhouses are coming out, and I just don't know that Indoor Spiders really fits that super well. I know it's picking up a lot on ladder recently, so maybe we'll see some new and interesting versions come out with it, but I don't think it's nearly as consistent as Sea Monsters currently, and it's a little too easy to stop. It just doesn't have great matchups into a couple of the tier 1 decks at the moment. Frostbite is the most consistent way to stop an Atrocity Indoor combo, as well as Sea Monsters has access to like double removal in response to like Vengeance, Nautilus's Riptide. So Frostbite Ezreal is pretty interesting. It's like a worse Vi deck than Viheimer and a worse Ezreal deck than Karma Ezreal, but it lets you free up your Ionia, so you're really only going to see this in lineups that really want to do something with Ionia, or players who really hate Ionia but still want to run an Ezreal deck, and diversifying your power regions like that does hold a fair bit of value. The regional versatility on this one's really low. The power level and consistency are relatively high, power level being higher than consistency, because it is still an Ezreal deck, it is still a Vi deck, you do have very powerful tools at your disposal, but you don't get to 20-0 someone with Ezreal as often, which is why I say the consistency is down a little bit. And overall, you rely a lot more on chip damage than you would in something like Karma Ezreal. Pilfer is actually one of the few tempo decks that we have in Runeterra, and I don't throw around that term very often. I like to use mid-range where I can, but this deck definitely feels like it curves out, and if it doesn't, it kind of loses. The power level is actually not super high. The consistency is really where this deck shines, which is weird to say for a deck that steals cards from your opponent, but the consistency of the things that you're doing on your own are pretty high. Like, you are going to consistently steal cards from your opponent. You are going to consistently play out your own units. You're going to hit Riptide Rex on 8. The problem is that the power level isn't super high. You're lacking in removal. If Riptide Rex doesn't pair well into a matchup, you don't feel super great. Generally, we have seen this deck struggle with Sea Monsters and Frostbite in the past, just because of how quickly the boards can get very big. And taking away from Freljord and Sea Monsters means that you've got an awkward Shadow Isle deck ahead of you. You know, maybe you're running something like Spooky Karma or Karina Veraza, but overall, Pilfer can actually be a little bit awkward to fit into a Conquest lineup where you're region locked. Vlad Sejuani, there's really not much to say. I think it's just a weaker Swain Sejuani. It's still a good deck, but it's just not, like, I just don't know why you would ever run Vlad Sejuani over Swain Sejuani. Spooky Karma's like the other Ionia deck in the format. We haven't seen it be too popular recently, but I think it's one of those things that's kind of ramping up. And I could be wrong about this. I was wrong about TF Swain ramping up in the past, but I think Spooky Karma's a little bit different. Being able to split up your Ionia and PNZ does kind of take away the auto-ban Viheimer mindset that your opponent has and makes them think a little bit harder about stuff like that. And I definitely think that there are good lineups that you can pair with this. Overall, pretty high in power level, pretty high in consistency. The regional composition is really where this one comes into question, and that's something that I'm going to have to track over the next couple of weeks to see if it can move up to tier 1. Spider aggro is just kind of a deck that we've seen round out aggro lineups recently, so I would say that it's the lineup that you build around it is very strong. It's a very streamlined strategy. It's one of the better decks to run in a 3 aggro lineup. The problem is that the consistency is called into question, as it is with most aggro decks. I definitely feel like if you are running aggro in a tournament, the general bar for a power line is about here. Like, your deck must be this powerful to be tournament viable, and aggro decks definitely feel like they get held to a higher standard. Like, if a mid-range deck performs averagely, it's going to do pretty well in a tournament. If an aggro deck performs averagely, it's not going to do very well. They kind of have to overperform. It definitely feels like they're held to a higher standard. I hope that makes sense. So Karma Lux fits into regional compositions pretty well. If you want to free up your PNZ and split up your Ionia, this is also an option. The problem is that the power level of the deck is obviously very high. Its consistency is definitely not what it used to be. The early game plan for this deck was typically Eye of the Dragon, and that's a lot harder to get off consistently, especially with the Deep Meditation nerf. And overall, I just think that this deck is not quite the beast that it once was. The nerfs are definitely felt, and I think the consistency on this deck is way down, and that's why I put it in tier 3. Freljord Elusives, while high in power and relatively okay in consistency, kind of fall into the thing I was talking about earlier, where aggro decks are held to a higher performance standard. But also, the regional compositions that it fits into are a little bit weird because you are taking away Ionia and Freljord. That means that Noxus is pretty much unplayable for you unless you go for Spider aggro, and you're really just kind of pigeonholing the rest of your lineup by wanting to run Freljord Elusives. I think this deck is actually just going to fall off the tier list entirely once we see Ionia burn come out. Karina Veraza, pretty low in consistency, pretty medium to high in power level, doesn't fit into lineups super well. Sea Monsters and Heimerdinger are like two of the powerhouse decks of the tier 1 lineup. I think Frostbite's generally seen as kind of the weakest of the 3 decks. So taking yourself off of Viheimer and Sea Monsters means you have to run a completely different lineup, and I'm not convinced that Karina control actually pairs that well into Sea Monsters. It should pair pretty well into the Frostbite control, and I think that's why we still see this come out in a few lineups. But overall, you're still just waiting for that Commander Ladross, and if you don't see Commander Ladross in a timely fashion, the game gets a lot harder for you, and you don't really have any draw power to get into that. So I think the consistency of this deck just really kind of brings it down. It also felt the Brood Awakening nerf more than any other deck. So Bannerman is just a little bit too predictable lately. The consistency of the deck is still high. The compositions that it fits into is still high. The power level is where it really seems to struggle. Not much has actually changed about the power level of the deck. You know, you only lost 1 attack off the Grizzled Ranger and the Badger Bear, but that was enough to just kind of plummet this, as well as just the format that we were finding ourselves going into. I think that even without the nerfs, Bannerman would have started to fall off because it doesn't pair very well into Frostbite control. It doesn't pair super well into Sea Monsters either. And overall, Bannerman, while it feels good, is just like the epitome of a mid-range deck, and Frostbite just preys on mid-range decks super hard. You're very weak to the Swain Sejuani. You're just a little bit too predictable at this point, if that makes sense. I actually don't know why we see barrel control in tournament that often. I just do not think it's ever better than Sea Monsters. The power level of the deck, it's like, I see it so infrequently, I don't actually know how to kind of judge this deck in terms of power level and consistency. Like, you have to really like this deck to want to run it, because I think you should just be running Sea Monsters like 99 times out of 100. TF Swain fits into lineups extremely well. Noxus and Bilgewater can definitely be something that's left over a lot, especially if you're not going for your traditional tier 1 lineup. If you are going for something like Indoor Spiders, TF Swain fits into most of the lineups that Scouts fits into, and as I had mentioned earlier, Scout seems pretty versatile. If you decide to go off of Sea Monsters, you do take the Noxus away from the Frostbite as well. Overall, the power level and consistency of the deck actually isn't that high. You're really hoping to hit that Leviathan Swain combo, and I think Swain Sejuani has kind of overtaken it in terms of power, especially because Twisted Fate just doesn't feel like a super impactful champion right now. I used Teemo for this one because every Noxus PZ burn deck that I've seen just plays Teemo now. I think players are still kind of figuring that one out. We haven't seen it perform super well. The consistency of the deck is way down. The power level of the deck is pretty down. And the compositions that it fits into are also down, as we see Viheimer and Frostbite kind of take over the PZ Noxus areas for you. So overall, Burn's just very much on its way out, or at least changing. And for something like discard aggro, I think that your power level is way too low for the commitment that it takes for a deck like this in terms of regional composition. I mostly brought you guys back just to tell you that the video's over. I appreciate you checking out my tier list. You know, if you want to message me about it, that's totally fine. I've got all my socials in the description down below. Don't be shy about hitting me up. Just be polite, please. Yeah, as I mentioned, the Google Sheet in the description down below. Going to be constantly updating that with deck lists and updating the tiers and things of that nature, moving stuff around. So yeah, I look forward to kind of talking with you guys about this, and look for a new tournament tactician tomorrow to help you prep for the weekend.